Hey guys, tonight we step into the cobbled streets of 19th century London, where fog curls around gas lamps and the rattle of iron wheels wakes the city before the sun even fully rises. You're standing at the edge of a chilly yard, watching a row of horse-drawn omnibuses line up for their day's work. The air smells of hay, damp leather, and something less poetic, yes, horse manure, but you'll get used to it. Crews tug reins, drivers tug scarves tighter against the cold, and conductors bark orders in voices already hoarse at 5 in the morning. Welcome to the peculiar world of London's horse-drawn schedules, where timetables were more hope than science and survival depended on the endurance of both man and beast. And here's your cheeky reality check. If you think your morning commute is bad, you probably wouldn't survive crammed onto a wooden bench bouncing along cobbles, squeezed between a grocer's basket of cabbages and a snoring clerk drooling into your sleeve. So, before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And hey, drop a comment with your location and your local time. I love seeing who else is awake, or who's already halfway to bed. Now, dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. The horses stamp impatiently in the yard, their breath steaming in the dawn. Conductors march about with clipboards, or rather chalkboards, scribbling the day's assignments. Omnibuses stand in neat rows, their roofs dripping dew, their harnesses clinking like jewelry for giants. Drivers, with heavy coats and stiff hats, climb aboard and test the reins, while conductors fuss with fare boxes and signal bells. The first runs of the day are precious. They bring clerks into the city and milkmaids back from early deliveries, the arteries of London just beginning to pump. Mainstream historical fact? By the 1820s and 1830s, London's omnibus system had exploded, with dozens of companies competing for passengers. Each morning, before most of the city stirred, depots like this one sprang to life, dispatching vehicles to timed routes, at least in theory. In reality, the city's traffic jams, weather, and sheer unpredictability made the idea of punctuality more of a polite suggestion. Quirky tidbit? Some depots actually employed time boys, young lads tasked with running ahead of the first omnibuses to shout the schedule at stops. Picture a kid sprinting through foggy streets yelling, 7:30 omnibus to Paddington, only for the actual bus to lumber in at 7:52. A living timetable, always out of breath. Historians still argue whether these chaotic mornings reflected genuine mismanagement, or simply the unavoidable realities of a rapidly expanding city. Were companies incapable of discipline, or were London's streets simply too unruly for any clock to tame? Some say incompetence ruled, others that it was miraculous the system functioned at all. You shuffle along with the crowd, breath frosting in the morning air, listening to the rising chorus of hoofbeats. The ground vibrates beneath you, and the smell of oats mixes with coal smoke drifting from chimneys. The drivers snap their whips, not cruelly, just sharp enough to signal the start, and one by one the omnibuses lurch forward, wheels crunching over cobbles, lanterns swinging like sleepy stars. The day's peculiar schedule has begun, and you're along for the ride. The first coaches rattle out of the yard, wheels groaning, horses clopping in steady rhythm, and you find yourself staring at the simplest but strangest part of the whole system. How on earth do people know where these lumbering boxes are going? Painted boards bolted above the driver's seat display cryptic names. Paddington, Bank, Brixton, Hampstead. It feels more like deciphering a puzzle than catching a ride. Here's your mainstream historical fact. In 19th century London, omnibuses did not run with numbered routes like modern buses. Instead, their destinations were painted boldly on boards or even just chalked hastily before departure. Passengers memorized which omnibus ran past their street, often learning by word of mouth or trial and error. It was navigation by literacy and luck. You shuffle along the street, squinting up at a rattling coach labeled Piccadilly. The board is smudged with soot, and the paint flakes off like dandruff on a dandified clerk's shoulders. Imagine trying to figure this out in the rain, with half the boards illegible and 3 different coaches claiming Paddington, but taking wildly different paths to get there. Here's the quirky tidbit. Some companies relied on brightly dressed barkers, men who would shout the destinations at potential riders, often embellishing with creative promises. To the bank in 20 minutes! One might roar, though in truth, you'd arrive faster by crawling on hands and knees through a sewer. Still, their voices carried down the street, pulling passengers in like carnival barkers at a fairground. Historians still argue whether the chaos of these signboards was a deliberate strategy, or merely poor planning. Did companies keep the system confusing to trap passengers who didn't know better, or was London simply growing too fast for tidy organization? Some scholars argue it was accidental anarchy. Others say it was brilliant marketing by men who knew confusion sells tickets as well as clarity. The sensory details are vivid. The boards creak above the horses, painted letters glistening in fog. The air smells of tar from the wheels and hay from the feed bags. You hear barkers shouting destinations like auctioneers, their voices echoing between shop fronts and taverns. A clerk hurries past, glances up at bank, painted in crooked white, and hops aboard, trusting the word and not the map that doesn't exist. And here's your gentle joke. You picture a tourist asking, "Which omnibus goes to Paddington?" and being told, "All of them, eventually." It's the kind of timetable that works only if you're in no hurry, or if you enjoy surprises, like ending up in Hampstead when you meant to visit your aunt in Chelsea. By the time you climb aboard, you realize the boards aren't really maps, they're invitations. Half promise, half puzzle, they set the stage for a journey whose destination might be less important than the clattering ride itself. The wheels rumble on, and soon you realize that while the boards might tell you where the omnibus wants to go, the real mystery is when it will actually get there. The schedule is stitched together from pocket watches, church bells, and pure optimism. Here's your mainstream historical fact. Conductors and drivers relied on their own pocket watches, often not perfectly synchronized, to keep to a company's official timetable. But London's patchwork of local time signals, bells, clocks, and later the new Greenwich Time Standard meant there was rarely a universal agreement. A bus scheduled to depart at 7 might leave at 6:55 by one watch and 7:05 by another. You sit behind the conductor, watching him tug a dented silver watch from his waistcoat. He squints, mutters something about being late already, then gives the driver a sharp nod. The driver cracks the whip, and off you go. Whether you're on time or 10 minutes behind is anyone's guess. The hoofbeats set the rhythm of the morning, but no bell tower or clock face seems willing to match it. Here's the quirky tidbit. Some companies tried to enforce precision by timing departures with giant hourglasses kept at depots. Picture a conductor flipping an absurdly large glass of sand, waiting for it to trickle down before barking, "Off we go!" Unfortunately, a rainstorm or traffic jam made the sand trick about as useful as a chocolate teapot. Historians still argue whether Victorian Londoners genuinely expected punctuality from omnibuses or whether they accepted delays as part of city life. Was the system failing passengers, or were passengers simply too accustomed to chaos to complain? Some suggest that omnibuses were seen as social spaces where time was elastic. Others argue the delays caused constant frustration, masked only by British stoicism. The sensory details wrap around you. The conductor's watch ticks faintly against the louder clop of horseshoes, the street smells of coal smoke and damp wool, and bells toll unevenly across the city, each declaring its own truth about the hour. Passengers sigh, tap canes impatiently, or shrug and chat about the weather. Time here isn't precise, it's negotiated. And here's your gentle joke. You imagine a passenger storming up to the driver and shouting, "You're 5 minutes late!" The driver tips his hat and replies, "On whose clock, sir?" By the time you settle back on the hard wooden bench, you realize the timetable of the omnibus is less about minutes and more about motion. The horses keep clopping, the wheels keep rattling, and London moves forward at its own peculiar pace, watches be hanged. The clatter of hooves grows louder as the conductor tugs a small rope dangling inside the omnibus. You hear a sharp ring from a brass bell above the driver's head. 1 ring means go, 2 means stop, 3 means slow down. It's a language of bells, taps, and whistles that keeps the whole lumbering contraption vaguely under control. Here's your mainstream historical fact. London omnibus conductors use simple bell codes to communicate with drivers, since shouting over the racket of wheels and horses was nearly impossible. These codes were standardized enough that most companies used similar patterns, though every crew developed its own quirks. You sit on the hard bench, watching as a nervous passenger tugs the rope to signal his stop. The conductor glares, mutters about improper timing, then gives the correct tug himself. The omnibus shudders to a halt, horses tossing their heads in protest. Everyone lurches forward, hats wobbling, parasols stabbing the air like tiny bayonets. Here's the quirky tidbit: some mischievous children, spotting the dangling cord through open windows, would dart alongside and yank it for fun. Imagine the chaos. Horses snorting, the omnibus screeching to a stop, passengers tumbling like dominoes, while the driver whirls around looking for the phantom signal. Conductors were known to tie the rope higher up just to thwart these pranksters. Historians still argue whether the bell code system truly improved safety, or simply added another layer of confusion. Was it a clever adaptation that made omnibus travel manageable, or a half-measure prone to accidents and miscommunication? Some accounts describe smoother rides thanks to bell signals. Others note frequent arguments between drivers and conductors when codes were ignored or misunderstood. The sensory details draw you in. The bell rings with a tinny clang, muffled by the creak of wood and the rhythmic clop of hooves. The conductor's boots scrape the floor as he steadies himself while tugging the cord. Outside, street vendors shout over the din, their cries blending with the metallic chime of bells until the city itself feels like one big orchestra of signals. And here's your gentle joke. You imagine a poor passenger tugging the rope politely once, only for the conductor to snap. "That was the slow down signal, sir, not the let me off before I'm squashed by someone's hatbox signal." By the time the omnibus lurches forward again, you realize that the peculiar bell codes were more than just noises. They were the nervous system of London's public transport, a system held together by ropes, rings, and the occasional prankster tugging from the street. The clanging of the conductor's bell fades as the omnibus trundles on, but soon you notice another rhythm, one that doesn't come from the passengers or even the cobblestones. It comes from the horses themselves, their breath misting in the morning chill, their hooves pounding like drums. These animals aren't machines you can run endlessly. They need breaks, food, and sometimes a complete swap mid-route, a hidden schedule within the public one. Here's your mainstream historical fact. Most London omnibus companies kept teams of horses on rotation, swapping them every few miles at designated yards. A horse might pull a coach for only 2 or 3 hours before being led off to rest, eat from a nosebag of oats, or drink from water troughs set up along the roads. Without this rotation, no timetable would last a day. You watch as the omnibus pulls into a side yard. Stable boys hurry forward, unhitching the weary pair with the efficiency of stagehands changing a set. The horses snort, shaking their sweaty manes, while a fresh team is brought out, sleek, restless, eager to run. Within minutes the omnibus is moving again, as though nothing had happened. Passengers barely look up from their newspapers, though the smell of hay and horse sweat lingers in the air. Here's the quirky tidbit. Some companies gave their horses names that passengers came to recognize. A particularly stubborn gelding named Thunder was so notorious for refusing to move in rain that regulars would groan upon seeing him harnessed. Others swore certain horses knew the route so well they stopped at familiar corners unprompted, like furry conductors with better memories than the humans. Historians still argue whether omnibus horses were treated as valued assets or as expendable labor. Some records show careful feeding schedules and rest rotations, suggesting genuine care. Others reveal overwork, injuries, and high turnover. Were they partners in public transport or just cogs in a machine powered by oats and whip cracks? The truth likely lies uncomfortably in between. The sensory details sink in, the creak of leather harnesses as they're unbuckled, the stamping of hooves on damp straw, the sweet-sour scent of sweat mixing with oats. You hear the slap of reins and the snort of fresh horses eager to stretch their legs. For a moment, the whole city seems to pause for this ritual of exchange. Passengers adjusting hats, horses swapping shifts, time itself reshuffling. And here's your gentle joke. You imagine a conductor explaining a delay to grumpy passengers by saying, "Apologies, gentlemen, The horses are on their lunch break. One clerk grumbles back. So am I, but nobody swaps me out. By the time the omnibus rolls back onto the road, you realize the real timetable isn't written in chalk or watches, it's written in horseflesh. Every journey is measured in oats, hooves, and the endurance of animals who, for better or worse, kept London moving at their peculiar pace. The fresh horses lurch forward, and suddenly the pace picks up. You're jostled shoulder to shoulder with a half-awake clerk, a milliner balancing a hat-box, and a boy with a parcel that keeps poking your ribs. This is rush hour, Victorian style, noisy, crowded, and governed by a strange etiquette that's half courtesy, half survival tactic. Here's your mainstream historical fact. By mid-morning, London omnibuses were packed with commuters, clerks bound for the city, shopgirls heading to Regent Street, and messengers darting everywhere in between. Seating was first come, first served, with the lower deck preferred by those seeking shelter from weather, and the roof seats cheaper but windier. Passengers were expected to follow unwritten rules of conduct, even if the vehicle rocked and lurched with every hoofbeat. You grip the wooden bench as the omnibus jolts over a cobblestone rut. Hats tilt dangerously, canes slide, and a woman's parasol jabs you in the ear before she mumbles a faint apology. The conductor squeezes down the aisle, fare box jangling, muttering, "Move along, plenty of room," when clearly there isn't. You suck in your stomach and wonder if "plenty" means something different in 1860. Here's the quirky tidbit. Some omnibuses enforce seating etiquette so strictly that gentlemen were expected to give up space not only for ladies, but for ladies' shopping parcels, dogs, or hat boxes. One satirical cartoon shows a man perched miserably on half a bench while an enormous basket of laundry enjoys the full seat beside him. Historians still argue whether Victorian bus etiquette was genuinely respected or mostly ignored in practice. Did passengers uphold the genteel ideal of deference and politeness, or did elbows, parcels, and sheer human stubbornness win out? Diaries suggest both. Some rides were genteel, others descended into squabbles worthy of a tavern brawl. The sensory details surround you, the smell of wet wool coats mingling with horse sweat, the scratch of straw matting underfoot, the conductor's bell jingling with every stop. Voices rise, clerks debating stock prices, maids gossiping, a child whining that his legs have gone numb. Outside, rain patters against the omnibus roof, dripping in through cracks to dampen your sleeve. And here's your gentle joke. You picture a passenger squeezed so tightly that when the conductor demands his fare, he replies, "Gladly, sir, but my wallet is currently trapped under 3 strangers and a terrier." By the time you rattle past another crowded corner, you realize the true rush hour ritual wasn't just about getting somewhere. It was about enduring the peculiar ballet of elbows, parasols, and unspoken rules that kept London moving, one cramped bench at a time. The rain finally lets up, but the streets are a swamp of mud, manure, and ruts deep enough to swallow a boot. The horses plod forward, their hooves slapping water into the air, while passengers sigh and groan as the omnibus lurches and fits and starts. Any hope of keeping to schedule vanishes as London's weather adds its own unpredictable edits. Here's your mainstream historical fact. Rain and mud were among the greatest enemies of Victorian transport. Streets were rarely paved beyond the central districts, and even where they were, drainage was inconsistent. A sudden downpour could turn a 10-minute trip into a 40-minute crawl. Conductors were expected to soothe tempers while drivers coaxed the horses through slop and puddles. You feel the omnibus tilt as one wheel sinks into a rut, the entire vehicle rocking like a ship caught in a wave. Passengers clutch their parcels. One man's hat slides forward over his eyes. The conductor rings the bell sharply. 2 pulls stop, but the driver can only shrug. Stopping in this mire makes things worse. Better to push ahead and hope the horses find footing. Here's the quirky tidbit. Some drivers carried little bags of sand, sprinkling them in front of the horses to give them traction in especially slippery spots. Others swore by sprinkling ashes from their own pipes. Imagine depending on the remains of someone's tobacco habit to keep a 1-ton vehicle from skidding into a lamppost. Historians still argue whether these weather delays were tolerated with British stoicism or met with daily outrage. Were passengers resigned to London's climate, treating delays as inevitable, Or did every late arrival spark muttered complaints about poor management? Diaries suggest both. Some sighed and endured, others loudly blamed horses, conductors, or even Parliament. The sensory details soak into you. You smell the wet wool coats of fellow passengers, dripping steadily onto the straw-covered floor. You hear the horses' frustrated snorts, and the squelch of hooves pulling free of muck. Raindrops drum against the omnibus roof, then trickle through the cracks, leaving cold streaks down your collar. And here's your gentle joke. You imagine a conductor announcing, "We are slightly delayed due to inclement weather." A soaked passenger replies, "Slightly? Sir, I could have rowed a boat faster." By the time the omnibus finally rattles onto a drier stretch of road, you realize that London's timetable isn't written in watches or bells. It's written in rain clouds and mud, as capricious as the weather itself, and no amount of chalk schedules can quite tame it. The rainwater still drips from your coat when the conductor shuffles past again, fare box clattering against his hip. He juggles coins, torn tickets, and half-legible chalk notes, while the omnibus jolts over potholes, turning arithmetic into acrobatics. You realize that keeping passengers moving wasn't just about horses and wheels. It was also about pennies, shillings, and a surprisingly intricate system of fares. Here's your mainstream historical fact. Omnibus fares in Victorian London were charged by stages, short sections of a route usually about a mile long. A passenger traveling the full distance might pay several pennies, while someone hopping off after one stage paid less. Conductors had to track who boarded where, who paid for which stage, and when their fares expired, all while the bus lurched and shook. You watched the conductor punch holes into tickets with a metal clipper, muttering the stops under his breath. He seems part mathematician, part magician, turning copper coins into slips of paper that somehow line up with the company's ledgers. His fingers move so quickly you half expect him to pull a rabbit from his fare box. Here's the quirky tidbit. Clever Londoners quickly learn tricks to save money. Some would hop off just before a stage ended, walk briskly for a few minutes, and rejoin the same omnibus later to avoid paying for the next stage. Others argued passionately with conductors about the exact moment a stage boundary had been crossed, as though debating ancient geography. Historians still argue whether conductors were scrupulous accountants or opportunistic tricksters. Were they diligently upholding the fare system, or did they round up in their own favor when passengers looked too timid to argue? Diaries mention both, the honest conductor with a spotless ledger, and the rascal who pocketed pennies like a magician palming cards. The sensory details surround you, the metallic click of the ticket punch, the sharp jingle of coins, the scratch of chalk as the conductor notes down his tallies. The omnibus rocks and sways, but the man never misses a beat, balancing himself like a sailor on a stormy deck. And here's your gentle joke. You imagine a passenger protesting, "I got off one stage early," only for the conductor to reply, "Yes, but your umbrella rode the whole way, and I must charge accordingly." By the time the conductor collapses back onto his perch, you realize that fares weren't just money, they were part of the peculiar dance of schedules. Each penny was a tick of the clock, each stage a step in the choreography of London's rolling, rattling commute. The conductor tucks his fare box under his arm, but your eye drifts to the outside of the omnibus itself. Painted across its sides are bright, bold slogans, the kind that jolt you awake more than the rocking of the wheels. Pear's soap, for the complexion. Tonic wine, revives the spirit. The bus isn't just carrying passengers, it's carrying advertisements, rolling through the city like a painted billboard on hooves. Here's your mainstream historical fact. By the mid-19th century, omnibuses were among London's prime advertising spaces. Companies rented the sides and even the roofs of buses to hawk everything from patent medicines to seaside resorts. With omnibuses clattering constantly through crowded streets, they became moving spectacles, ensuring a brand's name traveled far faster than a single poster nailed to a wall. You picture it vividly, a whole row of buses lined up, each painted with slogans in bright reds, greens, and golds, jostling for attention like carnival floats. Housewives glanced up from shopping baskets to read about soaps. Clerks groaned at yet another tonic promising miraculous hair growth. Some omnibuses even sported rooftop boards towering over the passengers, selling goods to anyone craning their necks from the pavement below. Here's the quirky tidbit. One omnibus famously carried a giant plaster model of a pair of spectacles fixed to its roof as a stunt for an optician. Imagine ducking under a low bridge and worrying less about the passengers' hats than whether an enormous fake pair of glasses might get knocked into the Thames. Historians still argue whether these rolling adverts cheapen the dignity of the omnibus or cleverly subsidized affordable fares. Were they eyesores cluttering the urban landscape, or ingenious tools that helped keep costs down for everyday riders? Some hailed them as democratic publicity, others sniffed that they made London look like a circus. The sensory details wrap around you. The horses clop steadily forward while the painted boards flash past in the mist. The smell of wet paint sometimes lingers on freshly decorated sides, mixing with the omnipresent tang of horse manure. You hear barkers shouting destinations but also hawkers echoing the slogans aloud, as if the city itself has joined the sales pitch. And here's your gentle joke. You imagine a passenger pointing to the painted advert for tonic wine and sighing, "I've ridden this route 3 weeks straight, and still no one has revived my spirit." By the time the omnibus rattles into its next stage, you realize that every timetable included not just people and parcels, but words. Rolling slogans stitched themselves into the fabric of the city, turning public transport into a parade of promises, some true, many dubious, but all impossible to ignore. The daylight fades, but the streets remain restless. You watch as an omnibus creaks by with its lamps lit, glass globes glowing faintly yellow against the soot-dark sky. This is something new, an experiment in night service, a daring gamble in a city that rarely expected public transport after dusk. Here's your mainstream historical fact. In the latter half of the 19th century, some London companies trialed late-night omnibuses to cater to theatergoers, night shift workers, and revelers spilling out of pubs. These services were rare and tentative, since running horses and staff after dark added costs and risks. But they marked the beginning of an idea that would eventually lead to today's round-the-clock transit. You hear the lamps rattling in their brackets as the bus clatters past. Passengers climb aboard nervously, tucking scarves tighter as the night air seeps through the boards. The driver squints at the flickering glow, reins taut, while the conductor rings the bell a touch more often than usual, wary of unseen pedestrians darting from shadow to shadow. Here's the quirky tidbit. Some companies employed special, night watch, guards who rode shotgun on late omnibuses, not only to deter pickpockets but also to fend off the occasional drunk who tried to climb aboard without paying, or in one case, tried to swap seats with the driver mid-route. Their presence lent these late services a theatrical air, half stagecoach, half traveling tavern. Historians still argue whether Londoners truly wanted night omnibuses or whether the companies were simply overambitious. Were these late services practical innovations responding to a changing city, or mere stunts that rarely turned a profit? Some accounts describe eager crowds after theater performances. Others note nearly empty rides, horses clopping through deserted streets for little gain. The sensory details are sharp in the cool dark, the hiss of gas lamps mounted at corners, the soft glow spilling into fog, the smell of damp cobbles and spilled ale. Inside, passengers murmur in low tones, their voices muffled by the creak of wood and the rhythmic stamp of hooves. Every sound feels amplified in the night, bells sharper, wheels louder, laughter more conspiratorial. And here's your gentle joke. You imagine a weary conductor announcing, "Next stop home," only for a tipsy passenger to slur, "Splendid, sir. If you could remind me where that is." By the time the omnibus rattles on into the midnight hour, you realize that these experimental services stretch more than the day. They stretch the very concept of urban life, proving that London's peculiar schedules didn't end when the sun went down. The lamps glow faintly, the wheels keep grinding, and now you notice not just the time of night but the peculiar choreography of the passengers themselves. The omnibus isn't only a vehicle, it's a rolling stage where rules of class, gender, and propriety are endlessly rehearsed. And sometimes, those rules are stranger than the journey. Here's your mainstream historical fact. Victorian omnibus etiquette dictated where passengers should sit and how they should behave. Ladies were often given preference for inside seats, while men were expected to yield space, not only for women, but for parcels, umbrellas, and even small pets. Dogs, when permitted, rode free on laps. Luggage took priority over knees. Conductors enforced these rules with varying degrees of seriousness, sometimes sparking disputes that delayed entire runs. You glance around the cramped cabin. A gentleman squeezes himself sideways so a woman's oversized hat box can rest comfortably, while another clutches his knees tightly as a terrier stares up from the floorboards, tail wagging each time the omnibus lurches. Above, passengers on the open-top deck lean against the wind, hats tied down with strings like battle flags. Here's the quirky tidbit. One satirical sketch in a London paper showed a man exiled to a single plank of seat, while an enormous parasol and 3 baskets of eggs occupied the rest. The caption read, "The Omnibus, where parcels enjoy more liberty than men." It wasn't entirely a joke. Plenty of complaints survive about passengers being squeezed by luggage of greater size than the owner. Historians still argue whether etiquette in omnibuses truly reinforced Victorian ideals of civility, or simply revealed the cracks in them. Were Londoners really polite enough to endure discomfort for the sake of decorum, or did such rules breed constant low-level conflict? Accounts differ. Some describe gracious exchanges, others grumble about endless quarrels over space. The sensory details place you right there. The scent of damp wool and lavender water mingling in the cramped air, the scratch of wicker baskets sliding across the floor, the muffled bark of a terrier as the conductor shushes it with a sharp glance. Outside, the wheels splash through puddles, and above it all the horses breathe heavily, pulling not just weight but the burden of etiquette itself. And here's your gentle joke. You picture a conductor scolding a passenger. "Sir, your elbows are occupying a stage they haven't paid for." The man frowns, nudges his elbow in, and mutters, "Then charge my knees too, they've been here since Hampstead." By the time the omnibus rattles on toward its next stop, you see that London's peculiar schedules weren't measured only in hours. They were measured in manners, in who yielded a seat, in how a hat box could command more respect than the man crammed beneath it. The city thins out as the omnibus leaves the bustle of the Strand and trundles into quieter lanes. The air feels fresher here, though the clop of hooves and rattle of wheels never stop. This is the suburban stretch, the long routes to Hampstead, Chelsea, or Hammersmith, where the peculiar schedule reveals yet another layer of strain and invention. Here's your mainstream historical fact. Suburban omnibus routes were significantly longer than the central ones, often stretching several miles. Longer journeys meant careful planning for horse stamina, meal breaks, and staggered departures. Conductors had to calculate fares across more stages, while passengers complained that the ride took forever. Some routes were so long that entire teams of horses were swapped midway, adding yet more unpredictability to arrival times. You lean back as the omnibus lurches past rows of terrace houses, smoke curling from chimneys into the dusk. The conductor checks his fare box, sighs at the empty seats, and mutters about long-haul fools. It's clear these routes tested both patience and profit. For every clerk who needed to get home to Hampstead, there were 3 who gave up and hopped a train instead. Here's the quirky tidbit. One suburban line became notorious for drivers who stopped for tea mid-route. In Hampstead, locals joked that if you wanted to catch the omnibus, you should first check the nearby tea shop to see if the driver was still finishing his scone. Passengers often grumbled, but the drivers argued that horses, like men, couldn't run on empty. Historians still argue whether suburban omnibuses were essential services or doomed curiosities. Did they open up the edges of London for commuters before railways took over, or were they inefficient relics clinging to routes too long for their own good? Some insist they offered vital access to growing suburbs, others call them little more than rolling delays. The sensory details change as you ride further. The city's crowded roar fades into quieter hoofbeats echoing on narrow lanes. You smell damp earth, chimney smoke, and the sweet scent of hay drifting from roadside stables. Inside the omnibus, passengers slump drowsily, their voices hushed, lulled by the endless sway and rattle of the journey. And here's your gentle joke. You imagine a passenger asking the conductor, "How long until Hampstead?" The conductor replies, "When the horses tell me, sir, not a minute sooner." By the time you near the outer suburbs, you realize that schedules weren't just bent by weather and traffic, they were stretched by distance itself. Longer routes demanded patience, flexibility, and sometimes tea breaks disguised as timetable strategy. The horses clop steadily, the lamps flicker, and now the omnibus rolls into a depot yard at the end of a long day. Here, behind the street scenes, another schedule reveals itself, less glamorous, but just as crucial. While passengers step off and vanish into alleys, workers swarm around the vehicle like surgeons preparing for an operation. Here's your mainstream historical fact. Omnibus depots were busy hubs of maintenance, housing workshops for repairing wheels, greasing axles, and fixing harnesses. Each night, mechanics inspected vehicles, carpenters replaced broken boards, and wheelwrights trued the iron rims that had been battered by cobblestones. Without this hidden labor, the omnibuses would collapse under the weight of daily journeys. You watch as men with soot-stained hands jack up a wheel, spin it, and peer at the wobble. Sparks fly as another file smooths the jagged edge. The smell of grease and linseed oil hangs thick in the air, mixing with the sharper tang of horse sweat and straw from the stables next door. Timetable chalkboards lean against the wall, smudged and rewritten, like exhausted promises renewed for the next dawn. Here's the quirky tidbit. Some depots became infamous for their eccentric fixes. One repairman was said to wedge broken axles with slices of seasoned oak until proper parts arrived, joking that the tree was sturdier than any iron. Another allegedly painted the same omnibus 3 different company colors in a single month, depending on who owned it that week. Passengers joked they could track mergers by the layers of flaking paint. Historians still argue whether omnibus companies genuinely invested in long-term care or merely patched vehicles to keep them rolling. Were these depots centers of craftsmanship that sustained public transport, or were they hasty workshops churning out stopgap fixes to stretch profits? Records show both pride in skilled trades and shocking stories of neglect. The sensory details place you right there. Hammering echoes against brick walls, sawdust litters the floor near a carpenter's bench, and a horse neighs impatiently from the stable as if to complain about the weight. The lamplight catches the sheen of fresh grease on a newly oiled wheel, glistening like a promise of smoother rides tomorrow. And here's your gentle joke. You imagine a passenger tapping the omnibus side and muttering, "Feels solid enough." A mechanic nearby chuckles, "Aye, sir, but don't lean too hard, or you'll own half of it." By the time the last lamp is extinguished, you realize that London's omnibus schedules weren't kept only on the road. They were kept here, in the grease, the chalk dust, and the steady hands of men who stitched another day of travel together from splintered wood and weary wheels. The depot quiets as repairs are finished, but out on the streets the competition never rests. You rattle along once more, only to hear the unmistakable clang of a tram bell and the hiss of iron wheels gliding along tracks. For all the careful timetables and horse rotations, the omnibus faces rivals that are faster, smoother, and hungrier for passengers. Here's your mainstream historical fact. By the late 19th century, horse-drawn trams and suburban railways began to erode the omnibus's dominance. Trams, running on fixed rails, offered steadier rides and more reliable schedules, while railways whisked commuters farther and faster than any horse could manage. By the 1890s, experimental motorbuses were appearing too, their noisy engines hinting at the end of horsepower. You sit inside as the omnibus jolts, feeling every rut in the cobbles, while a tram glides past on polished rails, its bell dinging smugly. Passengers crane their necks, muttering that trams never seem late, and the conductor tightens his jaw, ringing his own bell as if to drown out the competition. Here's the quirky tidbit. Omnibus companies sometimes ordered their drivers to race trams for passengers at busy stops, whipping horses into faster trots just to snatch a few extra fares. These impromptu sprints earned cheers from children on the pavement, and groans from passengers inside, who swayed like potatoes in a sack each time the coach jolted around a corner. Historians still argue whether the omnibus adapted cleverly to competition or stubbornly resisted change. Some accounts describe companies tweaking timetables, offering cheaper fares, and repainting their vehicles to attract riders. Others portray them as dinosaurs, clinging to horse schedules while trams and trains stole their future. Was it resilience or denial? The evidence suggests both. The sensory details sharpen. The tram's smooth glide contrasts with the omnibus's rattling shake. Sparks flicker as iron wheels strike stone. The smell of coal smoke drifts from a locomotive rumbling overhead. Inside, the conductor clutches his fare box tighter, as though holding on to the past with jingling coins. And here's your gentle joke. You imagine a passenger leaning out of the omnibus to shout at the tram. "Slow down! You're ruining the romance of being late!" The tram rider smirks and replies, "Romance is overrated. I prefer punctuality." By the time the omnibus pulls into another crowded stop, you see it clearly. Every timetable was a battlefield. Horses and bells on one side, rails and engines on the other. London's peculiar schedules were about to change forever, even if the omnibus pretended not to notice. The last rays of daylight fade, and you climb aboard one final omnibus for the evening. The lamps are lit, passengers nod sleepily, and the horses seem to know it's their last run of the day. The peculiar schedule that began with foggy dawn and frantic departures now winds toward silence, every hoofbeat carrying the weight of an ending. Here's your mainstream historical fact. Omnibus services wound down after dusk, with most companies pulling their vehicles into depots by late evening. Horses were unharnessed, fed, and bedded down, while conductors tallied fares and drivers reported delays. The day's chalkboard schedules were wiped clean, ready to be redrawn in the morning. You picture the depot yard once more, lamps glowing in windows, the air thick with the scent of hay and grease. Conductors turn in their fare boxes, drivers rub stiff hands, and mechanics give wheels one last check before shuttering the workshops. The city doesn't stop, but the omnibuses do, their time measured in horse stamina, not clocks. Here's the quirky tidbit. Some passengers treated the very last omnibus of the day as a social ritual, nicknaming it the All Bus. Poets, drunks, and insomniacs alike preferred its slower pace and quieter company, claiming the ride at night was more philosophical. One diarist even joked that the owl bus should charge double, for it delivers not just bodies but musings. Historians still argue whether the horse omnibus deserves to be remembered as a triumph of urban order or a muddled experiment in logistics. Was it a stepping stone toward modern transit, or a chaotic system never truly tamed by timetables? Some hail it as revolutionary, others dismiss it as a noisy, smelly, short-lived prelude to rails and motors. The sensory details close and around you, the soft hiss of lamps, the rhythmic sway of tired horses, the creak of leather harness. Passengers slouch in half-sleep, hats tipped low, while the conductor yawns between half-hearted bell pulls. The city beyond still bustles, but inside this rattling wooden box, time seems slower, gentler, almost dreamlike. And here's your gentle joke. You imagine a weary passenger asking, "How late are we?" The conductor sighs and replies, "So late, sir, that tomorrow is already polishing its boots." By the time the omnibus rolls back into its depot, you see the full arc of its peculiar schedules. From dawn to dusk, through mud, manors, and rival trams, these horse-drawn boxes kept London moving, slowly, imperfectly, but with a rhythm all their own. The horses are unhitched now, their hooves resting in straw, their day's work done. The lamps in the depot flicker low, and the last conductors shuffle homeward, fare boxes empty, voices hushed. The streets grow quieter, only the faintest clop of hooves echoing in the distance, fading into the hum of a city falling asleep. Let yourself breathe slowly, the way the horses breathe in their stalls, steady, deep, unhurried. Each inhale feels like the steady pull of reins, each exhale like the slow rolling of wheels over cobblestones. You've traveled the whole day's schedule, from dawn's first fog to night's last quiet ride, and now you too can let go of timetables and noise. Picture the omnibus yard resting under starlight. The wooden benches are empty, the painted adverts silent, the bell ropes dangling motionless. Even the city seems softer, its bustle muted, as if holding its breath until morning. You are safe here, in this quiet moment, carried not by horses but by calm. Let the peculiar rhythm of London's omnibuses fade into the rhythm of your own breath, slow and steady. Feel the day's weight ease from your shoulders, the way harnesses are lifted from tired horses. And as you drift, imagine that somewhere a conductor pulls one last bell, not to signal a stop or a start, but simply to whisper, "Rest now. The journey continues tomorrow."